So, welcome everyone. I'm Shelley Barwick. I'm the Domestic Violence Advisor for the Ministry of Justice for the whole of the South Island. Now, I wasn't going to talk today. Last night I got a call from the Family Court Coordinators, couldn't make it today, so I'm going to do a brief overview of the Family Court Coordinators role, and then I'm going to introduce Kate and Naomi, who are victim advisors who work in the criminal court. So I'm briefly going to go over the role of the domestic violence, the Family Court Coordinators. The Family Court works with many different acts under many different legislations, the main being the Care of Children Act, the SIFS Act and the Domestic Violence Act. At the Family Court in Christchurch we have 3 Family Court Coordinators, that's Barbara Warren, Chris Leifberg and Heather Smith. And they're located in the District Court building still at 282 Durham Street in the main court building. The FCC role, although they cannot advocate on behalf of clients, they are a good point of call to discuss information about how to get protection orders and other agencies able to assist people in the process. The coordinators cannot, however, offer any legal advice to people or assist with writing affidavits. They are a really good point of call to check documents before they are filed and are available to talk with clients or agencies about the processes for obtaining a protection order either with or without notice. The new way of contacting the FCCs now is through a central calling number, an 0800 number, or you can visit the Ministry of Justice website, which has copies available of all the applications needed under the Care of Children, domestic violence, any of the legislation. I'll talk a wee bit about my role. So I'm Domestic Violence Advisor, as I said. The position was developed and attached to the legislation of the Domestic Violence Act in 1995. It was all about changing the legal response to domestic violence. Aims of the DV Act was to reduce and prevent violence in domestic relationships through recognising that domestic violence in all its forms was unacceptable, and to ensure that where DV occurs, there is effective legal protection for its victims, and this included children who witnessed the abuse. And how would that be achieved? To empower the court to make certain orders to protect victims and to provide appropriate programs for victims of DV. And requiring respondents to attend programs that have a primary objective of stopping or preventing domestic violence, and enforcement in the event of a breach of that order. There's 4 of us that have the domestic violence positions across New Zealand, and they are unique within the MOJ because we focus solely on DV processes and practices. A large part of our role is to ensure the courts have the right agencies available to refer both protected persons and respondents to programs. That's 3 types of programs. That's respondent programs, protected persons programs and children's programs. And to ensure those program providers meet the Ministry's DV program approval regulations by looking at risk and quality assurance. And the role has a huge part of it is a liaison role with internally across the courts, that's in both jurisdictions, that's criminal and family, and across all the government sectors, and that we're active within our communities to see where there are gaps and where those gaps need to be filled with programs. So I'll pass you over to the victim advisors to go over.
Hold that for me.
Yep.
So I'm Kate Collins, and I'm one of 7 victim advisors for the Ministry of Justice and based at the Christchurch courts on the corner of Armour and Durham Streets. In our team we have 2 specialist sexual violence victim advisors, of which Naomi here is one, and we have our own building which is sort of behind the main court building down by the river, to enable victims to visit us without having to possibly encounter defendants in the same building. So a bit of history. The victim advisor role was piloted in 4 courts in New Zealand in 1993 because there was recognition back then there was a lack of information available for victims, and there's this very, very poor service being provided for them by the court system in general. So the victim advisor role became a national service operating out of the 35 courts in New Zealand in 2001. And in 2002, the Victims' Rights Act was enacted, which further developed the rights of victims and is our guiding piece of legislation. So our role involves keeping victims of crime updated and informed about what's happening in court regarding the case that affects them. And we also make sure they're aware of what supports are available, what their rights are, and we help them to have a voice in the proceedings. This can include putting their views to the judge about issues such as bail and sentencing. So our service is optional. People don't have to take part if they don't want to. It's just offered to them. It's entirely free to them and it's confidential. And part of our role also involves preparing victims who need to give evidence in court by taking them up to the court beforehand, showing them around an empty courtroom and letting them know what to expect on the day, what sort of questions they might be asked, and just fully preparing them for being a witness in court. So we deal with victims of crime, all victims of crime, from someone who's had their letterbox smashed by a complete stranger right through to victims of, or families of homicide victims and everything in between really. But a large amount of our work is domestic violence cases. So we estimate that about 30% of our caseloads would be women in domestic violence situations, but that actually accounts for about 80% of our actual workload, so it's time-consuming sort of stuff. Most of our referrals would come from the police, but victims can also self-refer to our service just by walking in or coming to the court buildings, and they will take them down to us. So our involvement with the victim starts when the defendant first appears in court, and our involvement finishes once the case is disposed, unless an appeal is lodged about the sentence, in which case the same victim advisor picks up the case again for continuity for that victim. So we're aware that, unfortunately, in some cases where the only service the domestic violence victim is actually linking in with, many of them come to us because they didn't call the police themselves. Perhaps the neighbours overheard and called the police, or somebody witnessed it. They didn't want the police to press charges. They want the court case to just go away and to resume the relationship with the defendant. And they know that we can help them to get their voice heard in court, so we have something that we can offer them that they're wanting. So when victims come to us who aren't linked in with other services already, we encourage them to link in with support services, and we use self-reflective practice to gently challenge some of their thinking around the relationship. We interview the victim to put their views to court, and during this interview we canvass safety issues, safety planning, what services are already involved, whether referrals to support services need to be made, whether they're under any duress from the defendant, which is often the case, whether children are involved, etc. And although we have to put the victim's own views forward to the court, we also provide some context around that, so the judge is aware of the dynamics in that particular relationship. Where we have concerns about safety, we work very closely with the police family violence team who talked earlier, refuges, who've spoken already as well, counselling services and child, youth and family. So since June 2013, we have 2 full-time specialist sexual violence victim advisors, I've mentioned Naomi already, who work in both the district and high courts. So Naomi's representing them today, and we'll be here for the rest of the day if anybody's got any questions they want to ask us later. So sexual violence victim advisors work exclusively with sexual violence victims, and they have a reduced caseload to allow them to do more intensive therapeutic work with those clients. They follow the same service provision I've just outlined already, and they work with other sexual violence specialist services, the police, victim support and ACC accredited counsellors. We're often confused for victim support because our name is so similar, but we're actually completely different, and our service is very different as well, so just that's something to be aware of. So in terms of contacting us, we have our own direct dial phone numbers and email addresses, and we also have an 0800 helpline number and a generic email address, so people can contact us on those if they're not sure who the allocated victim advisor is for a certain victim. And that's pretty much us.
Any questions?
Any questions?
Yeah, and we do have some leaflets at the back going over protection orders, etc., in the family court and the criminal court. Excellent. Thank you.